All right, strap in, everyone. We're about to take a deep dive into a topic you guys have been clamoring for. And let me tell you, the source material you sent over on this one is seriously intense. We're talking about Saddam Hussein's trial, but not just like, was he guilty or not, but like
Mm.
a real deep dive into the whole thing.
Yeah, you guys really went all out this time. I mean, we've got legal docs, historical analysis, even some really in-depth stuff on the inner workings of Saddam's regime.
Yeah. It's going to be a wild ride for sure, trying to piece it all together, but I think we've got some great starting points here. Like Philip Maniak's paper, that one's all about the trial itself, and then there's Robert G. Rabel's paper, The Making of Saddam's Executioners. That one sounds pretty intense, right?
Oh yeah, A Manual of Oppression by Procedures. That's Bill's subtitle. Gives you a sense of what we're dealing with.
Whoa. Okay, so yeah, heavy stuff. Let's set the stage here. So Saddam was on trial for, a lot of really horrific stuff. The Tajil massacre, the gassing of the Kurds, oppression of the Shiites, the list goes on.
And those charges, all of them, were ultimately judged by the Iraqi Special Tribunal Court. That's the ISTC.
ISTC, got it. Okay.
But there's a twist right off the bat with this court. It wasn't some long-standing Iraqi institution. The ISTC was actually created by the United States during their occupation of Iraq.
Hold up. So the U.S., the country that just invaded and occupied Iraq, they set up the court that tried Saddam.
Yep, talk about complicated, right?
Yeah.
Immediately raised questions about the court's legitimacy, whether it was truly independent.
Yeah, was this a genuine attempt at justice, or what was that term you used earlier?
Victor's justice.
Victor's justice, that's it.
It's this idea that after a conflict, the winners, they basically get to write the rules, decide the verdicts, maybe even without a truly fair and impartial trial for the losing side.
Okay, yeah, I see where you're going with this.
Yeah.
So people were worried that ISTC was just a way for the U.S. to exert its influence, maybe even guarantee a specific outcome.
Exactly. I mean, think about it. The U.S., they basically wrote the rules for the court,
Right.
trained the judges, even funded the whole thing.
Oh, wow, yeah. So naturally, people were like, hold on a second, this doesn't seem right.
Exactly. Critics were very vocal. They were like, this gives the U.S. way too much power. How can we be sure the trial's going to be fair with them pulling all the strings?
It makes you wonder if it was even possible for the trial to be seen as truly fair and impartial given the circumstances.
And then there were these even more concerning allegations swirling around that some judges were picked not because they were, the best legal minds, but because they had specific political leanings,
Oh, like they were already against Saddam?
or even had personal vendettas against him and the Ba'ath Party.
Whoa, wait, back up a sec. The Ba'ath Party. Remind me who they are again. It's been a while since my history classes.
Right, so the Ba'ath Party, that was Saddam's political party. They were all about Arab nationalism, socialism, that kind of thing. And they ruled Iraq, like, with an iron fist for decades. Their ideology was a big part of how Saddam controlled the country. We'll dig more into that later, but basically they were a force to be reckoned with.
Okay, so just to recap here, this trial, it was already like super controversial even before it started.
Oh yeah, loaded with international implications right out of the gate. But okay, ready to delve into some of the specifics of the charges against Saddam?
Let's do it. Where do we start?
Well, how about the Dujail massacre? That was one of the big ones.
Yeah, and from what I've read, it sounds like it started with an attempt to assassinate Saddam in this town, Dujail, and then things spiraled from there.
You got it. But there's a lot more to the story. Some accounts suggest Dujail was already kind of a hotbed of armed conflict, maybe even with Iranian involvement. It wasn't just Saddam randomly targeting innocent civilians.
And Philip Maniak, in his paper, he even argues that the number of deaths in Dujail might have been inflated by, like, Western media. He says Saddam's actions were technically legal under the Iraqi constitution at the time, given the context.
That's an interesting take.
Yeah.
Maniak really emphasizes how important the context is to understanding all of this, and it also brings up the whole issue of the evidence used during the trial. Like, how reliable was it?
Oh, yeah, good point. What kind of evidence are we even talking about here?
Well, a lot of it was based on these UN reports, and those reports relied heavily on testimonies from people who lived in Dujail. Eyewitness accounts, right? But, eyewitness accounts, they can be pretty unreliable, especially when you're talking about traumatic events. People's memories could be fuzzy, influenced by fear, or even a desire for revenge.
Right. Trauma can definitely mess with your memories.
So the reliability of the evidence used to convict Saddam,
Yeah.
that's definitely up for debate.
Okay, so we've got this politically charged trial, potentially unreliable evidence, and the whole world's watching. Did they even manage to reach a verdict with all this chaos?
Oh, yeah, they got there. Out of hundreds initially on trial for what happened in Dujail, Only 146 were convicted. 96 ended up being hanged, and another 46 died in prison.
Wow, that's a lot of people.
Right?
And Saddam, was he directly involved in those executions?
Well, the records show he personally signed the execution orders, but his defense argued he wasn't doing it out of personal malice, just fulfilling his presidential role, as allowed under Iraqi law.
So he signed off on the deaths of 96 people, but he was just doing his job. Doesn't sound right to me.
It's murky territory for sure. Adds another layer of complexity to this whole thing.
This is already a lot to unpack, and we're just getting started.
Oh, we're just scratching the surface. This deep dive is only going to get deeper from here. What's grabbing your attention the most so far?
I think what's really striking me is just how many irregularities there seem to have been during the trial itself. We're talking about basic violations of international standards of justice, like presumption of innocence, the right to a proper defense, the right to know what you're being accused of, all of that.
Yeah, the whole thing was just riddled with violations. I mean, there were reports of political pressure being put on the judges being dismissed for seemingly no reason, even witness identities being concealed from the defense team.
Wait, they hid the identities of the witnesses? How can you even defend yourself if you don't know who's accusing you?
Exactly. It makes a fair trial pretty much impossible.
Yeah.
And this wasn't just hearsay. These were documented irregularities. For example, the chief judge in the Dujail trial, he was a Kurd who openly admitted he'd grown up in Halabja.
Halabja, that rings a bell. Why does that sound familiar?
Halabja is the Kurdish town where Saddam was accused of using chemical weapons, gassing thousands of Kurds. So, you got this judge presiding over the trial, and he's personally connected to the very crimes Saddam's accused of.
Whoa, talk about a conflict of interest. That just throws the whole idea of a fair trial out the window.
And it gets even crazier. 23 out of the 29 witnesses in the Dujail trial, their identities were completely hidden. And 5 of them, they testified from behind a curtain.
A curtain? You're kidding, right?
Nope, dead serious. Imagine trying to cross-examine someone you can't even see. How do you assess their credibility? How do you challenge their testimony? It completely undermines the defense's ability to do their job.
This is just insane. It's like one thing after another. Oh, and remember that article you sent from the New York Times? They reported that some Iraqi politicians actually threatened the judges to make sure Saddam was found guilty.
Yeah. If that's true, then forget about judicial independence. We're not talking about a legitimate court anymore. It's a kangaroo court. The outcome's already decided.
So you've got a trial that's already a political mess. Then you add these blatant violations, hidden witnesses, threats against the judges. Yeah. It's no wonder Saddam's defense team had such a hard time.
Try putting yourself in their shoes. Imagine the pressure, the fear, knowing you can't properly defend your client because the whole system is rigged against you.
It's just wrong.
Yeah.
And it's not just about Saddam, right? This whole thing has much bigger implications.
Absolutely. If a trial like this, with all its flaws and problems, becomes the model for international justice, it sets a really dangerous precedent. What does that say about our commitment to justice, to human rights?
It's scary to think about, honestly. But okay, before we go down that rabbit hole, let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture here. We need to understand how Saddam's regime even functioned, how he managed to stay in power for so long.
Right. And that's where Robert G. Rabel's work comes in. He dives into the mechanisms of Saddam's control, and his main argument is that Saddam essentially turned everyday Iraqi citizens into informers.
Informants, like spying on each other.
Exactly. He created the system he calls oppression by procedures, a system designed to reward loyalty and punish any hint of dissent. It sounds like something out of a dystopian novel, but this was real life for millions of Iraqis.
Oppression by procedures? I've never heard that term before, but it sounds really ominous. What did that look like in practice?
Think about this. You need a background check from the security services for practically everything. Getting a job, enrolling in school, even getting married.
Seriously, even for marriage?
You bet. Every aspect of life was scrutinized. And if you had any family members considered even remotely opposed to the regime, forget it. You were automatically suspicious.
So people were either spying on each other or living in constant fear of being spied on.
That was the reality of life under Saddam.
Yeah.
And this wasn't some faceless bureaucracy either. The Mukhtar, the village chief, played a key role. They were the regime's eyes and ears in every community.
It's just heartbreaking to imagine a society where you can't even trust your own neighbors, where fear and suspicion are the norm.
It was a deliberate strategy. Saddam knew that a divided society is easier to control. If everyone's suspicious of everyone else, it's almost impossible to organize any kind of opposition.
It's like that old saying, divide and conquer, but on a societal level.
Exactly. And Saddam didn't stop there. His control extended even into the education system.
The education system, what do you mean?
Well, the Ba'ath Party, remember, they had their hands in everything, and education was no exception. They used schools not just to teach kids, but to indoctrinate them, monitor them, even recruit them into the party.
So it wasn't just about learning, it was about shaping young minds, molding them into loyal supporters of the regime.
Right. And if you refused to cooperate, refused to join the party, you were in big trouble. No access to higher education, no good jobs, maybe not even basic necessities.
Wow, it was a system designed to force you into complicity.
And the consequences for dissent were brutal. Expulsion from school, losing your job, imprisonment, or even worse.
It sounds like there wasn't much of a choice. Either you played by their rules or you faced serious consequences.
That was the reality for a lot of Iraqis. But it's important to remember that there were always those who resisted, even at great personal risk.
So there were cracks in this system of control, people who refused to be silenced.
Oh, absolutely. But the regime was very effective at crushing dissent. We can't forget the countless people who suffered, who sacrificed, because they dared to speak out against Saddam's tyranny.
So we've got this image of Saddam's Iraq, a country ruled by fear, suspicion, where every aspect of life was controlled. But who were the people actually enforcing these policies, carrying out the punishments? Who were Saddam's enforcers?
That's a really important question, and it takes us to this really fascinating concept that Rabil explores in his paper, the idea of willing versus unwilling executioners.
Willing versus unwilling, I'm not sure I follow.
It's this idea that not everyone who participated in this system of oppression was a true believer, Some were totally on board with Saddam's ideology, driven by things like tribal loyalty, ambition, or a genuine belief in his vision.
Okay, so those were the true believers, the ones who thought they were doing the right thing no matter how brutal their methods.
Exactly. But then you had those who participated out of fear, or because they were coerced, or maybe just because they felt like they had no other choice if they wanted to survive.
Yeah.
They might not have agreed with what the regime was doing, but they felt trapped.
So they were caught in this web of complicity, forced to do things they probably knew were wrong. That's messed up.
It's a tragic reality of totalitarian regimes that create these situations where it's almost impossible to draw a clear line between good and evil. It's all shades of gray.
It makes you wonder how many of these so-called unwilling executioners ended up doing things they never thought they were capable of.
And there are documented cases of people turning on their own families, just to protect themselves or to gain favor with the regime. It was a system that destroyed trust, even within families.
Man, that's just heavy. The moral dilemmas people must have faced under that kind of pressure. It's hard to even imagine.
It really highlights the insidious nature of Saddam's system, how it corrupted even the most basic human bonds.
So we've established that Saddam's regime wasn't just about brute force. It was about creating this all-encompassing atmosphere of fear and suspicion, a system designed to control every aspect of people's lives. But it's not just about assigning blame, right? We need to understand how this kind of system works, how it manages to turn ordinary people into instruments of its own cruelty.
Exactly, and that's what's so valuable about Rabel's work. He forces us to confront these uncomfortable realities of how tyranny functions, how it manipulates people, distorts their behavior, and ultimately leaves these deep scars on individuals and entire societies.
It's a reminder that fighting tyranny isn't just about getting rid of dictators, it's about dismantling the systems that allow them to exist in the first place.
And that fight requires understanding, courage, and an unwavering commitment to justice and human dignity.
Okay, so we've laid out the context here. We've talked about the systems of control Saddam put in place, the role of those who carried out his orders. But now let's shift gears and look back at the trial itself. What are the international implications of all of this?
That's where things get really interesting and where this deep dive truly begins. So Saddam's trial, with all its controversy, it wasn't just some isolated event, right? This thing had ripple effects across the globe, raised all sorts of questions about international justice that we're still grappling with today.
Okay, so let's unpack those international ramifications then. How does Saddam's trial measure up against, the accepted standards of international justice? Did it meet the mark?
It's a question that's been debated endlessly. Legal scholars, human rights advocates, everyone weighing in. Did he get a fair trial? Did the whole process adhere to international norms of due process, judicial independence, all of that?
From what we've talked about so far, it doesn't sound like it.
Yeah, it's definitely a mixed bag. But
Yeah.
there's one thing that's super important to keep in mind here. Saddam, he wasn't tried at the International Criminal Court, the ICC, the one based in The Hague.
The ICC, right. Remind me what that is again. I know the name, but...
Sure, so the ICC, It's a permanent court, and their whole deal is investigating and prosecuting individuals accused of the most serious crimes, the ones that concern the entire international community. Genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, that kind of thing. And it's a court of last resort, meaning they step in when national courts can't or won't handle these cases.
So it's like the ultimate court for holding people accountable for atrocities, no matter where they happen in the world.
Exactly.
Hmm.
But Saddam wasn't tried there. He was tried by a special tribunal, that ISTC we talked about, the one specifically set up for him in Iraq. And like we said, the creation of that tribunal, that was controversial from the start.
Right, because of the U.S. involvement, the questions about its legitimacy, the whole thing.
Yep, exactly. And it raises the question of whether this was truly about justice or more about, Victor's justice.
Okay, so we keep coming back to this idea of victor's justice. Can you break that down for me a bit more?
Sure. So imagine a conflict ends, right? The victors, they have the power to kind of shape the narrative, rewrite the laws, decide who gets punished, how they get punished. It can create a system where they're basically the judge, jury, and executioner all rolled into one.
That doesn't sound very impartial.
It's not. And that's a huge criticism of the ISTC. Was it really about delivering justice, or was it more about, consolidating power, maybe even getting revenge?
And didn't the ISTC also allow for the death penalty, which I think the ICC doesn't?
That's another key difference. The ICC, they're focused on due process, rehabilitation, that kind of thing. They see the death penalty as incompatible with their principles.
So you've got these two very different models of international justice going on here. The ICC, they're all about procedural fairness, following international legal norms. And then you've got the ISTC, which was, let's be honest, pretty closely tied to the U.S.-led occupation.
Yeah.
Totally okay with imposing the death penalty.
You got it. And Philip Menyoke, that paper you sent over, he even argues that if Saddam had been tried at the ICC in The Hague, the outcome might have been totally different.
He's saying Saddam might not have been sentenced to death if he'd been tried somewhere else.
That's his argument. The whole trial would have been conducted under stricter international guidelines, more safeguards in place to make sure the process was actually fair.
It makes you wonder if the U.S. and its allies chose to try Saddam in Iraq specifically to get that outcome, the death penalty.
It's impossible to know for sure, but it's definitely something to think about. And it raises these fundamental questions about the whole concept of selective justice.
Selective justice? What do you mean?
Well, who gets put on trial, where they're tried, even what charges they face. It often depends on political factors as much as legal ones. It's not always about what's right. It's about who has the power.
So some countries and some individuals, they face more scrutiny, harsher punishments than others.
It can feel that way sometimes. And that's one of those people criticize the ICC for too,
Yeah.
They say it tends to focus on Africa, other parts of the developing world, while kind of ignoring similar crimes committed by powerful nations.
Like a double standard.
It can definitely feel that way. And it raises questions about whether international justice is really about justice, or if it's just another tool used by the powerful to get what they want.
Okay, so, big picture here. What does all of this mean for the future of international justice? Where do we even go from here?
That's the million-dollar question, and is one we're still trying to figure out. Saddam's trial, with all its baggage, it's left this mark on international law, on the whole idea of accountability in a world full of conflict and injustice.
Doesn't sound like there are any easy answers.
Definitely not. But I think it's so important that we keep having these conversations, grappling with these tough questions. If we want a more just and equitable world, we can't shy away from these issues.
Agreed. Saddam's trial might be over, but the pursuit of justice, that's a never-ending story. But okay, before we get too deep into the philosophy of all this, I want to bring it back to Iraq for a minute. We've talked a lot about Saddam, the trial, the systems of oppression. But what about the victims? What happened to all the people who suffered under his regime?
That's such a vital part of this whole story, and I think it often gets lost in the focus on Saddam himself. For a lot of Iraqis, the trial was this long-awaited moment, a chance to finally confront their trauma, see their oppressor held accountable.
Like a moment of catharsis, finally getting some justice after all those years of suffering.
Exactly. But for others, it was the opposite. It brought back all those painful memories, reopened old wounds, highlighted the deep scars left by Saddam's rule.
Like a collective trauma, this shared experience of pain and loss that's still haunting the nation.
And the healing process for Iraq, individually and collectively, it's ongoing, and it's incredibly complex. It's going to take a long time, maybe even generations, to fully come to terms with all of this.
It makes me think back to those questions you asked earlier. If you were an ordinary Iraqi living under Saddam's rule, what choices would you have made? What would you have been willing to compromise to survive?
Those are tough questions, and they really make
Oh,
you think. They force you to step outside your own reality and try to understand the impossible dilemmas people in those situations faced.
yeah.
What would you do when faced with that kind of pressure? What are your values, and how far would you be willing to bend them to stay alive?
It really makes you realize that the lines between good and evil, they're not always so clear. People are capable of incredible things, both good and bad, depending on the circumstances.
And it also highlights the resilience of the human spirit, the ability to find hope and meaning even in the face of unimaginable suffering.
Speaking of resilience, there's something Menyock said in his paper that stuck with me. He argues that the trial, even with all its flaws, was still a step towards accountability.
That's a really interesting perspective.
Mhm.
It's easy to focus on the negatives, all the things that went wrong, but he's right. The fact that a trial even happened, that a dictator was put on the stand and forced to answer for his crimes, that's a powerful symbol.
Yeah, it sends a message to the Iraqi people and to the whole world that no one is above the law, not even powerful dictators.
And even if the trial wasn't perfect, it was a start. It showed that impunity isn't inevitable.
Like a crack in the wall, a little bit of light shining through.
And we can't forget the context here either. Iraq was, and still is, a nation in transition. They're rebuilding after decades of dictatorship, a devastating war. It's a long, difficult process.
So the trial itself, it was a reflection of that turmoil, this messy, imperfect process, just like the challenges facing the country as a whole.
Right. Justice is rarely neat and tidy, especially after conflict and trauma. It's a long road.
As you were going through all this material, what was your biggest aha moment? What really jumped out at you?
For me, it was the realization that Saddam's regime wasn't just about brute force. It was about creating this culture of fear, this atmosphere of suspicion and complicity.
Ah, that oppression by procedures that Rabil talks about.
Exactly. It was so carefully constructed, this system designed to turn people against each other, erode any kind of trust within communities. That, in a way, was even more insidious than the violence itself.
Because it created a society where everyone was afraid to speak their minds, afraid to trust anyone, always looking over their shoulder.
And that legacy, that fear and suspicion, it still hangs over Iraq today. It makes it really hard to build a truly free and democratic society when you're dealing with that kind of baggage.
It's like a poison that seeped into everything, making it that much harder to heal and move forward.
It shows how important it is to not just get rid of the dictator, but to dismantle the whole system that allowed him to thrive in the first place.
So it's not just about removing Saddam. It's about tackling poverty, promoting education, creating a culture where human rights are respected, and empowering people to hold their leaders accountable.
Exactly. It's a huge undertaking, but it's the only way to prevent future Saddams from coming to power.
This deep dive has been eye-opening for sure, but it's also left me feeling kind of uneasy. It's hard to balance the brutality of Saddam's regime with the hope for a better future for Iraq.
I get it. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the scale of the suffering, by the challenges they still face. But I think it's important to remember that even in the darkest times, there are always people working for a more just and equitable world.
Those everyday heroes, the ones who don't always get the attention, but they're out there making a difference.
Their efforts, their courage, their belief in the possibility of change, that's what ultimately shapes the future.
So even though we've explored some pretty dark stuff today, I'm walking away from this deep dive with a sense of hope. I believe that even in the face of incredible cruelty, the human spirit can endure, and eventually, it'll prevail.
I share that hope. And I think it's key to remember that Iraq's story, it's not finished. It's a nation with a rich history, a vibrant culture, and people who have shown incredible strength and resilience.
They deserve a future where they have a voice, where their rights are respected, where they can reach their full potential.
Absolutely. And I believe that future is possible, not through military intervention or political games, but through the hard work of everyday Iraqis who are committed to building a more just and equitable society.
It's their stories, their struggles, and their triumphs that will ultimately decide the fate of their nation.
And it's our responsibility, as citizens of the world, to listen to those stories, learn from them, and support their efforts to create a better future for themselves and their kids.
This has given me so much to think about. Before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with a final thought, something to ponder as they keep exploring this part of history, which is, let's be honest, pretty complex and often disturbing.
I like that. What do you have in mind?
Well, we've talked a lot about the systems of control that Saddam built, but what about the systems that allowed him to rise to power in the first place? What were the conditions that made his rise possible?
That's a crucial question,
Hmm.
and it often gets overlooked. We tend to focus on the individual, the dictator, but we forget that no one operates in a vacuum.
There are always these bigger forces at play, social, political, economic factors that create the environment where tyranny can take root.
Exactly. If we truly want to prevent future Saddams, we have to understand those factors. We have to address the root causes of inequality, injustice, and oppression.
It's a huge task. We're talking about tackling poverty, promoting education, fostering a culture that values human rights, and empowering citizens to hold their leaders accountable.
It's a massive, complex challenge, but it's essential if we want to build a world where peace, justice, and human dignity can actually flourish.
This deep dive, it's just the beginning. There's so much more to uncover, so many stories to tell, so many lessons to be learned.
We encourage you to keep digging, keep seeking out different perspectives, and never stop questioning the world around you.
Because the more we understand the past, the better equipped we are to build a better future. As we've been going through all this, the role of the international community keeps coming to mind. I mean, that we weren't just bystanders in this whole Saddam
Right.
saga,
Oh,
right?
absolutely not. Saddam's rise, his ability to hold on to power for so long, a lot of that was definitely influenced by actions and inactions on the world stage.
Like during the Iran-Iraq War, wasn't it the U.S. and other Western powers who were actually backing Saddam?
Yep, that's right. They provided him with weapons, intelligence, even financial aid. At the time, they saw him as a kind of buffer against what they perceived as the threat of Iran's Islamic Revolution.
So they were basically propping up his regime, even while knowing about all those horrific human rights abuses he was committing.
It's a prime example of realpolitik. National interests taking priority, even if it means overlooking or even supporting some pretty morally reprehensible things.
Realpolitik. Okay, that's one of those terms I've heard before, but not sure I totally get it. Can you give me a quick definition?
Sure. Realpolitik, it basically means conducting foreign policy based on, well, pragmatic considerations, power, national interest, that kind of thing. Not so much on ethical concerns or ideology. It's about doing what's best for your own country, even if it's not always the most ethical choice.
So kind of like the enemy of my enemy is my friend, even if that friend happens to be a brutal dictator.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And in the case of Saddam, that pragmatic approach had devastating consequences for the Iraqi people. The support he got from powerful countries, especially the U.S., it definitely helped him consolidate his power, continue that reign of terror.
It makes you think about the choices we make, both as individuals and as nations, and the ripple effects they can have. Sometimes those consequences, they're not what we intended at all.
Right, and then you've got the first Gulf War in 1991. The U.S.-led coalition, they pushed Iraqi forces out of Kuwait, but they stopped short of actually removing Saddam from power.
Yeah, I remember learning about that. There's a big debate about whether the U.S. should have gone all the way, taken Saddam out then.
And that decision, to leave him in power, some argue that it actually contributed to his sense of impunity. Like he could act with brutality and get away with it. No real consequences from the international community.
So it's not just Saddam we should be scrutinizing here. It's the international community too, right? They had a role in his rise, and they allowed him to stay in power for way too long.
For sure. There's a shared responsibility there. And I think that's a big takeaway from all of this. We can't just focus on individual leaders or even individual regimes. We have to look at the bigger picture, understand the web of relationships, the decisions that are made on a global scale. It's all connected.
It's like a giant puzzle, trying to fit all the pieces together. But okay, speaking of connections, were there any times when Saddam's regime actually tried to manipulate, use international actors to get what they wanted?
Definitely. One example that jumps out is the Oil for Food program. That was set up by the UN back in the 90s.
Oil for food, yeah, I remember hearing about that, but the details are fuzzy. What was that all about?
So, after the Gulf War, Iraq was under these really harsh economic sanctions. The Oil for Food program was supposed to help the Iraqi people who were suffering because of those sanctions. It allowed Iraq to sell a limited amount of oil, and in exchange they could get food, medicine, other humanitarian supplies.
Okay, on the surface, that sounds like a good thing.
The idea was good, but the problem was the program was riddled with corruption. Saddam's regime figured out how to skim billions of dollars off the top.
Whoa, so he was taking money meant for humanitarian aid?
Yep. illicit surcharges, kickbacks, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah.
And he used those funds to, fund his lavish lifestyle, reward his cronies, even boost his military. A total exploitation of a program designed to help people.
That's just sickening. Taking advantage of people in need, lining his own pockets while his people were suffering, it's just infuriating.
It shows how even these well-intentioned international efforts, they can be manipulated, exploited by regimes like Saddam's. It's a cautionary tale for sure.
This deep dive has been a whirlwind, that's for sure. Saddam's actions, international politics, the suffering of the Iraqi people, it's all so interconnected.
It is, and I think ultimately what we have to take away from all of this is that the fight for justice, for accountability, it never really ends.
It's an ongoing struggle at home and on the world stage.
You got it. It requires constant vigilance, commitment, and a willingness to confront some hard truths, not just about those in power, but about ourselves, our own role in systems that perpetuate injustice.
It's a lot to take on, but we can't ignore it.
We can't. It's a responsibility we all share, as individuals, as communities, as nations. We got to keep learning, keep asking questions, keep challenging the status quo, and keep working towards that world where peace, justice, and human dignity can finally win out.
This deep dive has been incredible. Thank you so much for taking this journey with us. We've only scratched the surface here, but hopefully it sparked your curiosity, made you think about things in a new way, and inspired you to keep digging for the truth.
That's what we hope for. There's always more to learn, more perspectives to consider, more connections to make. So keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep fighting for a better world. We'll see you next time.